Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to AEI for another one of our Ed and Helen Hintz book events. This is going to be a great one. You can never talk about President Lincoln enough, and we have a really great guest to talk about his new book, Lincoln and the Fight for Peace by John Avlon. And so I want to just say one more word about Ed and Helen Hintz. They are wonderful supporters of AEI, of course, and they love supporting our series of book events which we've had. They're also great Americans, and we're very grateful to them for their support. We're also very grateful to you, John, for coming and for writing this great book. John is a political analyst at CNN and a historian, a writer of histories. This is not his first. You wrote a book about Washington and a book about independent nation, how centrists can change American politics. And now we have Lincoln and the Fight for Peace. So thanks for being here, John.
Thanks for having me. It's a great honor.
John and I have a little bit of an intersection in our past.
True.
John spent some time working for the mayor of the city of New York, and I spent some time working for another mayor of the city of New York,
And the governor.
And the governor.
Don't sell yourself short.
That's right. And so we intersected in that regard, and those times in the late 90s and early 2000s were exciting times in the city. And
They were.
You did great work there, John, and I was pleased to be associated with your work there. But let's talk about this book and Lincoln. But before we get to that, tell me how you were a speechwriter for Mayor Giuliani, and now you're CNN political analysis. What led you to be a writer of histories?
I'm the grandson of immigrants, and so I think that it's a very common thing for, my grandparents were incredibly patriotic and really felt that this country had given them a gift beyond compare, and were incredibly proud Americans. I mean, my mother's father, served in World War II after coming through Ellis Island at the age of 3, and was a Ohio Republican who loved Harry Truman, and so I think part of that was just the environment in which I was brought up, where you had a sense of the way that the American presidency and politics and history created kind of a firmament around the country. That was the American mythology, and it gave you a sense of place and mission and direction. And part of what I'm passionate about, whether I'm working in politics or journalism, I love overlaying history into that work because it imposes a sense of perspective, which of course is the thing we have least of in our politics. So all of a sudden, whether it was writing a speech or writing a column or on air, if you can bring some history into it, I think it takes people, it makes them aware in a fuller sense of the opportunities and obligations of the moment. It makes it more interesting, and so that's something I love. And then also whether I'm working as an editor-in-chief or a columnist at different stages of my career in journalism, writing history is a great counterpoint. It balances the day-to-day.
Yeah, it gets you out of the day-to-day battle and back and forth.
Yeah.
You can get away and think for a while.
For sure.
So the book is about the period of time from the re-election of President Lincoln in November of 1864, till his assassination. And then you talk about Reconstruction and other issues that are related to Lincoln's efforts to make the peace after the war. And I wanted to just sort of take us through that period of time. Obviously there's the Second Inaugural, but before that, there was a sort of aborted effort at a peace conference. What was Lincoln's efforts there? How he was actually pretty strong there, pretty tough. He held the line. Tell us about that, and then how it is how it relates to his later sense of forgiveness.
This is a great story from the book, and I appreciate you drawing it out. And I think it's fascinating on several levels. You can shorthand it by saying it's sort of Lincoln at Reykjavik, but it's a lot more. I mean, first of all, this is Lincoln, really the first American president, I believe only American president, to be conducting a peace negotiation in wartime, albeit during Civil War. He's doing it at Hampton Roads, Virginia. It's February. The 13th Amendment has just passed. And Grant has received word that he believes is credible that there are a couple of high-ranking Confederate cabinet members, including Vice President Alexander Stephens of the Confederacy, who want to come talk peace. So Lincoln meets them on the River Queen, which is the presidential steamship. So think of it as sort of the aquatic Air Force One. and they get there ahead of time, And Lincoln arrives later in the day, and it's kind of a master class in negotiation. Certainly, I wrote it that way implicitly, but looking at, obviously what was said and what was done. First of all, Lincoln begins by using humor to break the ice, so to speak. He's disarming. He's known Alexander Stephens. They served together in Congress during Lincoln's one term. They were both Whigs, members of the Whig Party. But he's also very clear about his sort of bottom line, right? So you all can have peace anytime you want. I just have 3 indispensable conditions. And he's written them out on paper. Okay, so the first 2 are pretty self-evident when you think about it for more than half a second. One is a resumption of federal authority, right? The South has to rejoin the Union, accept the laws, and what this amounts to is a renunciation of any alleged right to secession. Second thing is an end to slavery for all time, right? Lincoln's very focused on this idea that you've got to remove the root cause of the war. Otherwise, the war will reignite. As he says, no one wants peace more than I, but I'm unwilling to accept a peace if it's achieved on conditions which would only guarantee further war, further bloodshed. The third one is the unexpected one that I think shows the genius of Lincoln and how he's thinking long term, which I think is particularly true of reconciling leaders, as Lincoln was. He says, no ceasefire before surrender. That one kind of takes you aback. It's not really on the level of, federal union and ending slavery for all time. So why was it so important to him? First of all, he knew his audience. They actually proposed as a counter, they said, well, we come to this great idea that we think the North and South should unite and Congress should grant a ceasefire, and then the North and South will unite and invade Mexico together. And we'll dislodge the Emperor Maximilian in kind of a muscular assertion of the Monroe Doctrine, and then we'll work out all the details after the fact. The enemy of my enemy being my friend will bring us back together again. And Lincoln basically laughs it off. And for 2 really good specific reasons. One is that, well, if I'm going to grant you guys a ceasefire, that's going to have to go through a treaty process in Congress, and that would imply that you are a legitimate independent nation, which you are not. He never grants, in any form, rhetorically or otherwise, recognizes the sovereignty or the independence of the Confederacy, which of course drives the Confederates crazy. The second thing is more important. He knows a ceasefire would be incredibly popular, right? I mean, 750,000 Americans have died, Americans on both sides. He's been called a butcher and a tyrant. The war's gone on longer than people, wanted it to, but he understands that if there's a ceasefire before surrender, that will, he believes, I think correctly, create some backsliding around the North's commitment to ratify the 13th Amendment. They'll say the war's over. It was always about union. It's not really about slavery, right? So look, we don't need to ratify that. So he's anticipating that. And so that's why he's insistent. His basic prescription for winning the peace is on evidence right there. It's unconditional surrender followed by a magnanimous peace. And indeed, he promises that. But in this particular negotiation, the Southerners can't get their heads around both the lack of recognition of their sovereignty and this idea that you've got to have a surrender before ceasefire. So it's unsuccessful on the surface, but it really highlights his resolve, the North's resolve, and the fact that now, after winning re-election and having the 13th Amendment pass, that they've got pole position, that he's in control now.
So it's a great story, and one thing I wanted to tell our audience is that John tells these things that we have read before in other documents. Obviously, we've all read a lot of this before, but you tell it in a really dramatic and compelling way, and without being, sappy or over the top. It's really quite good, and we're going to talk about
it's better than the alternative.
The way you write about President Lincoln and his son Tab. But before I get to that, I want you just briefly on the Second Inaugural, because that's the next thing that happens. And there's a lot been written about that. But what stands out for you that might have been missed about the Second Inaugural?
So I'm not going to say missed, because that would imply that I have insights that are greater. But here's what I tried to do that's a little bit different. And this is me as a former speechwriter playing a little bit. My previous book is on Washington's farewell address. So I like delving into the writing of speeches, the deeper meanings of speeches, the stories that went into their formulation, that sort of thing, and to make the actual day come alive. And March 4th, 1865 is an extraordinary day. And it begins this massive storm that rips through the city. The streets are all muddied. It's the first integrated presidential inauguration. The crowd is full of black Union soldiers and their families, so that itself is dramatically different. Congress is rushing to finish up its respective laws for the session. And Lincoln, of course, has been working on what would be acknowledged as his magnum opus, but it's not a speech that anybody expected. And he gets up to give it. It's been raining all day, as I said, and he stands up to begin to give a speech, and no fool, and you can see this in contemporary accounts, the clouds part and a beam of sunlight hits him as he walks up to the podium. And it really is, it is short. It's 700 words and change. So some people were still finding their seats when he was finished delivering it. It's not a policy speech. It's not a speech a president gives in the middle of wartime. It's instead suffused with magnanimity. Everybody remembers the final lines. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. What's interesting when you really look at the speech is that the last paragraph, which is close to perfect, is a real departure from the rest of the speech. The rest of the speech is a really Old Testament speech. It's about the Civil War as collective punishment by God for the original sin of slavery. And he says this war is about slavery. Don't believe anybody says it's about states' rights or constitutional liberty, which was an argument some folks made, believe it or not, or economics. Now it's about slavery. But crucially, while there's no moral relativism between the North and the South, he says there's no moral equivalence. He's not going to let the North rest easy with a sense of moral superiority. Right? Because he says, look, we bought the rice. We bought the cotton. We're responsible as well. And so this is God's punishment on all of us. And that's why the last paragraph is such a detour, but it really is a roadmap to reconciliation. And it's a speech that's suffused with faith. Religious quotes, direct and indirect. But it's a remarkable moment, I think, in addition to being, and when the speech was over, and Frederick Douglass loved it. He was up front clapping very loudly, but other people were stunned because it was more of a sermon than a kind of state paper. And it's the opposite of the speech you would typically expect in every way from a president leading a nation in a civil war.
So that's in early March. The war is not over. There's still some fighting to be had.
Yeah.
And the next thing that happens is his General Grant and the Union forces press, and Richmond is captured. And there are two things I want you to talk about, and you can do them in whichever order you want. But one is his last meeting, or his strategy meeting with General Grant before Appomattox, and the second is his tour of Richmond.
Sure.
And so however you want to take those, but let's talk a little bit about those.
Yeah, he has two major meetings with Grant before the surrender at Appomattox. And even though Grant writes the terms of surrender at Wilmer McLean's house, basically, off the top of his head, you can see very clearly Lincoln, he's basically taking dictation from his memory of what Lincoln has told him. And they've got two famous meetings. One is captured in that great painting, The Peacemakers, which hangs in the White House that Harry Truman actually bought on Lincoln's birthday in 1947. And they're on the River Queen, and Lincoln's seated in the chair, kind of leaning forward, listening. And there's Sherman is making a point. And this was all taken from interviews with Sherman and Grant and Admiral Porter, who were alive soon after Lincoln's death. So that the painter really, J.P. Healy, even captures Grant making a snapping gesture, saying, basically we've got, we're going to have a pincer move that's going to trap Lee. And Grant is kind of looking on very fondly at his old West Point friend, Sherman. One of my favorite quotes, by the way, about friendship is Sherman about Grant. He said, I stood by him when he was drunk. He stood by me when I was crazy, and now we stand together always. And then there's Admiral Porter, who's always like the Aunt Peggy of the, it's, and Porter, and Porter's always there. But he's the one who's taken the most copious notes, although over time his stories they start to embellish. But you really have you can recreate that meeting on March 29th, 1865 at noon in the River Queen. And Lincoln's consistently saying, he wants the war to end then and there with as least bloodshed as possible. He wants mercy to be shown, particularly to the Confederate rank and file. He says, let them have their horses to go home and plow their fields with, have their rifles to go home and shoot crows with. I want them to obey the laws and rejoin the nation.
Treat them liberally. We want these people to return to their allegiance and submit to the laws. Therefore, I say, give them the most liberal and honorable terms. That's Lincoln to Grant and Sherman.
That's right.
Before they go off. And President Grant, or General Grant, he was someone who followed the chain of command. I mean, if it seems logical to me that General Grant would be thinking, what was I told to do when I was in this moment here at Appomattox to write the terms? And they were informed. And I often think in the telling of history, President Grant has had a little bit of a reconstruction in the last 15 or 20 years.
Deservedly, I think.
And he deserves it. But sometimes they act as if he invented that on the spot, and there isn't any doubt that he didn't.
No, and as a matter of fact, you can even look, and Chernow's book does a very good job, particularly with the Grant presidency, that a lot of Grant's actions as president to try to fix some of the mess that was left him by Andrew Johnson were deeply informed by Lincoln's desired approach at winning the peace. For example, his use of a Southern Attorney General, Amos T. Ackerman, to contain and eradicate the first strain of the KKK by going after the upper echelons of leadership, but showing mercy to the rank and file, in effect, and having a Southern Attorney General do it. That's right out of Lincoln's playbook.
And just to stay on this one more time, there's a quote you use of Lincoln where he's talking to someone and he says, I would say, let them up easy, or let them up easy.
General Godfrey Weitzel, the 29-year-old German immigrant general who oversaw the occupation of Richmond. The last day, I'll get to Richmond. That's a good segue.
No, but you I would like to go with that, because that is, tell that story about how that happens and how President Lincoln says that.
So this is at the end of the day, and the trip to Richmond is how I begin the book. And I think it's one of the most, Lincoln and the fall of Richmond, I think, is one of the most cinematic moments in American history. And it really gets short shrift for reasons I don't fully understand. It's briefly depicted in the movie Lincoln, but that is a brilliant movie. But it's, first of all, to make a great movie about the passage of a constitutional amendment itself is so laughably, amazingly ambitious. I really take my hat off to him.
Yeah, well, I want to talk to you about the short shift part in a minute, but keep going.
But this is this is the moment that's really piled high with drama. You have the capital of the Confederacy has fallen. It's barely under Union occupation. It's really been abandoned by the Confederates, who light it on fire, right? In effect, the 25th Corps, which is a predominantly black regiment, is taking the lead to take the city, which is also commanded by a German immigrant named Godfrey Weitzel. And then they're sort of told to step aside and kind of written out of history, not as the first regiment in to the city. This is the great prize. And Lincoln gets word of it, and he's still at City's Point. He spends almost more than 2 weeks at the front lines in City Point with his son, Tad, and now it's the boy's 12th birthday. And he gets word that Richmond has fallen. He says, I'm going to go to Richmond. And everybody, including the Secretary of War, says, that's a really bad idea. Don't go to Richmond yet. It's incredibly dangerous. It's not fully secure. And he says, nope, I'm going to go anyway. And so Admiral Porter and he basically get on a boat with Tad, and they go up the river, and it's this extraordinary sort of river of doubt and danger. Their boat, they almost get crushed in a boating accident by a wheel of a steamship that's been stuck. They finally get pulled in on a longboat led by Marines. Their time is lost. They don't know where they're going. They've got to basically find a new place to land. There's no military escort waiting for them. So Lincoln gets off the boat. The city's burning. He's holding his son Tad's hand on the boy's 12th birthday. And he doesn't know where the army is. The place is completely unsecured. And then
it's kind of a ragtag bunch of 10 or 12 people just sort of walking down the street.
Yeah, they're strangers in a strange land. This is the opening line of the book, which is, Abraham Lincoln walked into the burning Confederate capital uphill from the river, passing abandoned slave markets on his right, holding his son Tad's hand on the boy's 12th birthday. It's this extraordinary moment, and the first people he sees are liberated slaves. And they recognize him, and they cluster around him, and it's very, and he says, don't kneel to me, you must kneel to God only, and thank him in the future for the freedom you will enjoy. And then they make their way up the hill towards the Capitol designed by Thomas Jefferson, really guided by sight, and eventually he bumps into a New York regiment, and they lead him to the Confederate White House, which has been hastily abandoned. And then he gives a speech, he's being followed by a huge crowd. primarily freed slaves, but also some poor whites, while all the Richmond matrons and grand dames who are still there kind of peering through their curtains at them. And he goes into Jefferson Davis's White House, and he sits down in Jefferson Davis's chair and looks out the window, and there's no triumphalism. He asks for a glass of water. And then he has a war council, and he meets with some of the remaining Confederates who are there to speak about terms of peace, to get a feeling for the people. And then he does a carriage tour around Richmond. And he's passing all these extraordinary places, that some of which he's walked by, including the building where the Constitution had been ratified 80 years before, which is unmarked, and John Marshall's house. Anyway, as he goes down to the, and this extraordinary, this is important for AEI, I think many of you, there's a prisoner, a prison, a former tobacco warehouse, which has been turned into a prisoner of war camp, and it was notorious, second only to Andersonville during the war. And now all of a sudden, it's got, Confederate officers in it. And there's an amazing story about a freed slave, his former owner recognizing him and saying, "Don't you recognize me?" And he says, "I do, get in there." But people cluster around Lincoln in the carriage at that place, and they say, "Tear it down, Libby Prison." And he says, "No, leave it as a monument," which I think is so profound, because it's about, we can't escape history by trying to erase it. We've got to confront it and to learn the right lessons. And then as he goes down to the docks at the end of the night, and the sun's beginning to set, and he's going to spend the night on a ship called the Malvern, Godfrey Weitzel asks him, he says, what should I do? What should I do about all these, traitorous rebels who are now under my control and my command? And Lincoln, very characteristically in terms of his leadership style, he doesn't give an order. He gives advice. He gives guidance. He says, he has some lovely lines about, I don't think we're going to find harmony through increasing resentment. If I were you, I'd let him up easy. Yeah. Let him up easy.
It's a great line.
It's beautiful.
And a key moment.
Yeah.
And, you say that's not been treated well in the movies. And one of the things and one of the reasons we're doing this is because we don't talk enough in popular culture about the greatness of our past leaders and of President Lincoln. And so we're going to do that, because that's been one of the failings of our country in the last 25 years, in my opinion.
I agree.
But on that topic, I wonder if you think that scene of freed slaves coming and treating him in the way that he did, that he had come and saved them, that would be, that the woke people wouldn't like that. Is that why you don't think it's been covered well, or
no?
Could that possibly
it's a fair question, and I'll answer your question by talking about the debate over the fate of the Emancipation Statute a few blocks from here. But let's just address Richmond. Yeah. There have been a series of fairly local regional volumes about, and thin about Lincoln and Richmond. I think, there's sort of a bias even in multi-volume biographies where you get to the end and people start condensing. I just think it has not gotten the centrality it deserves. And while I've never written anything, people are always talking about, whether things could be made into documentaries, saying Lincoln and Richmond could be its own standalone thing. It's that dense and that dramatic. Look, the speech you refer to at the front, I'm quoting a black journalist named Thomas Morris Chester, who's a brilliant writer who's been largely forgotten. He's an extraordinary human being. Born in Pennsylvania, Harrisburg, educated in New England at a boarding school, bitterly resented the racism that was in America, even though he was, a freedman. He actually went and was editor of the Star of Liberia newspaper for a time. The whole history of that is more complex than I think is often recognized. Then comes back when the war is out, and he wants to raise a militia. And even though Pennsylvania is being marched on, the Pennsylvania's governor at the time isn't ready for a black regiment, so he says no. So he goes and works for the Philadelphia Press as a war correspondent. And he's a brilliant writer. He's a great writer. And then after the war, his story is almost as interesting. He goes to law school. He becomes the first black person to argue in the Old Bailey in Britain. He visits Russia as a guest of Cassius Clay, the ambassador to Russia. And he ends up in New Orleans working, serving in a militia alongside James Longstreet, pushing back some of the white vigilante
But he's
groups.
the source of a lot of the coverage.
He
of
is,
Lincoln
yes. And sorry, and I mention that because you got to trust your sourcing, and I've got their contemporaneous reporters recording this, and obviously they don't have recorders and cameras. It's not going to be as precise as it is.
Yeah.
But so, so we cannot judge our history through the lens of what some people call presentism. Everything will fall short, as we will inevitably fall short in ways we can't contemplate in the eyes of history. So you need to do your best to understand history in the time in which it was lived. That doesn't mean you should abandon your judgment. You have the benefit of perspective, but you've got to. That's not too much to ask. I mentioned the Emancipation Statute because before I started waxing poetic about Thomas Morris Chester, which I like to do. So that's very controversial. Indeed, it was taken down, a replica in Boston, because it shows Abraham Lincoln and a slave getting off his knees, for now freed enslaved person, with the chains broken. And when you look at it through contemporary eyes, it's an uncomfortable power dynamic, I think is the way you would say it. Now, here's the crucial thing to understand about it. First of all, the statue was paid for with donations from former slaves. The statue is modeled after the image that was on the front page of the Liberator newspaper, which was the great abolitionist newspaper of its time. And the person in Lincoln's position was Jesus in that depiction. So that context is kind of important. It's also important to note that when that statue was dedicated in 1875, the keynote speaker, even though the President of the United States, Ulysses Grant, and the Supreme Court was there, the keynote speaker was Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass's speech there is a great speech, and it's a long speech, and there are a couple sections that are well known, but one in particular I think nails Lincoln's political disposition. I describe him as a soulful centrist. He's a reconciler in a time of radicals and reactionaries. But Douglass, I think, gets to the heart of it, where he says, look, seen from a genuine abolitionist ground, Lincoln could seem tardy, cool, and indifferent. He wasn't making the radicals happy. Indeed, he fought with them plenty. But seen from the perspective of an American president, a statesman who's bound to consult the opinions of his fellow citizens, he was zealous, determined, and radical. I think that's the wise balance to strike.
So that's what I want to get to next, which is now we'll talk about his philosophy of peace and reconciliation. Again, it is as awful a war as there ever was. Mm-hmm. The anger and bitterness and the loss is tremendous for him personally and for everyone in the North. There must have been terrible anger and resentment at what the Confederacy had done. And yet his vision of peace, his desire for reconciliation was very forgiving. And I think that's one of the main points of your book, is that despite this awful carnage, he wanted to bring enemies together. And now his assassination ended that, and so we didn't go down that path. But that is your theme, that kind of reconciliation after a deep division led by someone who fought in the fiercest fights is the way to go. Is that right? Is that what you would say?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also about best practices for winning a peace and the leadership style of a reconciling leader that Lincoln exemplifies.
And so after you tell this story and you tell the tragedy of his assassination, and you then go on to reflect on later periods in American history where that reconciliation either happened or didn't happen. And so, you talk about President Wilson in the wake of World War I. You talk about Harry Truman in the wake of World War II. Yeah. What's your themes there?
This is the unexpected detour the book takes when you're picking up a book on Lincoln that focuses on the last 6 weeks of his life. You don't think you're going to end up all of a sudden looking at
it is an unexpected detour, but it was enjoyable.
Yeah, thank you. There you go. And you end up at the failures of the Treaty of Versailles and the lessons from the Marshall Plan and the successful occupations of Germany and Japan. Look, I mean, I think, America's failures during Reconstruction are an example of the costs of not winning the peace fully, where we focused on reconciliation at the expense of emancipation and therefore did not succeed fully. And Woodrow Wilson is largely a product of that. Interestingly, Woodrow Wilson's father is a Confederate preacher who publishes pamphlets with biblical defenses of slavery. And so when he comes to office as a progressive, and the first Southern president since the Civil War, when he resegregates the federal government, I mean, he's reflecting his native prejudices as well as great deference to the Southern Democrats in his conference at the time. But what I talk really is about his role primarily in the Treaty of Versailles. So remember how I said that Lincoln's core prescription for winning the peace is unconditional surrender followed by a magnanimous peace. Right? That's the shorthand. There are political, economic, and cultural dimensions
And think of the
this.
choices that they have: citizenship, ability to vote for a former Confederate soldier, ability to own a weapon, ability to hold property. All of those things were at risk. And Lincoln said, no, I want none of that. I want to welcome them back firmly into the Union so long as they surrender and swear allegiance to the Union.
That's right. And of the Confederate rank and file, right? I mean, among the leadership class, the people who should have known better, the Confederate, the members of Congress and the military and the courts who defected in effect to the Confederacy, he didn't want to hang them, which is the traditional punishment for treason, which itself was sort of a concession. But he didn't want to grant them immediate amnesty either. He had to earn it back. He didn't want them to get their power back. And that's one of Andrew Johnson's failures is, he lets them claw back power very quickly. And so you get the black codes getting passed in like late summer, early fall, 1865.
Yeah, but wait. Slow down,
we're getting,
John. But even with Jefferson Davis, his line was, he tells a story that indicates that he just wished he went away.
Yes.
I don't want to put him in jail. Could he just disappear?
He doesn't want to make a martyr of him.
Right.
He doesn't want to make a martyr of him.
Right.
There's a couple funny Lincoln stories about that, but I don't know how much time we've got. He tells a story about a reformed drunk who's taken an abstinence, a temperance pledge. And he goes into a local tavern and asks for a lemonade, and he gets a lemonade. And the barkeep's an old buddy of his and says, do you want me to put a little brandy in there? And he says, well, if you slip it in unbeknownst to me, I wouldn't mind. And he tells the story to Sherman in the context of, if Jefferson Davis were to slip away out of the country unbeknownst to me, he wouldn't mind. Because he doesn't want to make a martyr of him. He'd rather have him in exile.
From a non-drinker like Lincoln, that's kind of an interesting story.
It's a really interesting story. That's right. But, he's self-medicated through humor. So.
Yeah. Okay, so not so good after World War I, obviously, caused the carnage of World War II.
But very
better after World War II. Is that your theme?
That is the theme, but let me actually do the cause effect there very quickly.
Okay.
So if Lincoln's basic prescription is unconditional surrender followed by a magnanimous peace, think about how we got that equation perfectly wrong in the Treaty of Versailles. Think about one of Lincoln's 3 indispensable conditions: no ceasefire before surrender. What did we do in the First World War? We offered a ceasefire before surrender. So the Germans never really accepted defeat, which gave birth to a new form of lost cause mythology, which would ultimately erupt in Nazism. There weren't any troops on their soil, and then we did the worst possible thing, right? We had not a magnanimous peace, but a punishing peace in the form of reparations that they couldn't really pay without the political will to actually enforce the terms. So it's the worst of all worlds. So one of the French field marshals, after even the Treaty of Versailles gets finally signed, and Wilson signs it all the way to get the League of Nations, but he doesn't get bipartisan support for the League of Nations, so that's all for naught. And one of the French field marshals says, after it's been signed and everyone's celebrating, says, this isn't a peace treaty, this is a ceasefire for 20 years. Now, we did it decidedly differently and importantly differently in World War II, and we followed Lincoln's prescription much more precisely and intentionally. Unconditional surrender followed by a magnanimous peace. First of all, remembering that the generation that won World War II are the grandchildren of the Civil War. So this is very much alive in their minds. We forget that. Think about what Churchill and FDR's official position after they meet in Casablanca in Morocco is unconditional surrender. And when asked about it, FDR tells a story, and incidentally, his press secretary at the time was Stephen Early, a direct descendant of Jubal Early, the Confederate general. He tells a story about Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox as a way of explaining to everybody what he means. He said, well, people think I'm being so harsh, but it's just what happened at Appomattox. And then think about the magnanimous peace that is put in place. First of all, the U.S. has been planning for this military governance, for military occupation. They set up college programs at the University of Virginia, Michigan, Yale, and other places. They were preparing to win the peace. They knew that was essential. Because if you don't win the peace, you don't really win the war. That's Lincoln's insight. That's what we also learned after the First World War. And so when you look at the occupations of Germany and Japan, as well as the Marshall Plan, you see that really come into fruition. I found a quote from Lucius Clay, who was the general who oversaw the occupation of Germany. And he is a son of the South, born in Macon, Georgia, 3 decades after the Civil War. And he's asked, what guided your decisions? And he said, I tried to think what Abraham Lincoln would have done for the South if he had lived. When I saw that quote more than a decade ago, that's where the book came from in my mind. And then you look at the Marshall Plan. This is Harry Truman working with Secretary of State George Marshall and Republican Senator Arthur Vandenberg. He's trying to expand the tent. He gets Vandenberg's buy-in early on. Vandenberg makes the package better, right? He contains it and constrains it. He insists on a Republican to run it, the head of the Studebaker Corporation. He says we need to have other nations have skin in the game. It can't be open-ended like a New Deal government program. But in a period of just a few months, they sell it and pass it through a Republican-controlled Congress. And it's an investment in peace. After a long war, it's an investment in peace. It's the opposite of reparations, and it works. Yeah. It works in profound ways.
So last question for me to bring it back to Lincoln for a minute, because is another part of the book that I recommend all of you to read and to see, because I think John does a nice way of depicting it. And I, who read a lot of Lincoln books, had not seen it as covered as thoroughly as you did. And that is his relationship with Tad, his 12-year-old son, who he takes into meetings, he has with him all the time, has him for this tour of Richmond. And I know that you're a father of little kids, and I wondered, what struck you about that, and why did you want to cover that so thoroughly?
Well, I think in part because I have little kids. And I was very touched by Lincoln's relationship with Tad. In the wake of Willie's death, Tad, who's a very rambunctious, big presence, kind of, running through the White House, crashing meetings, falling asleep by fireplaces, Lincoln is incredibly indulgent and loving towards him. And in some ways, he is really Lincoln's closest companion in the final years of his life. Yeah. He and Mary's relationship has been under enormous strain because of the death of Willie. And so he and Tad are just thick as thieves, and Lincoln is just delighted by him and by his antics in a very sweet, sweet way. And so that was just an emotional core of the story I thought we could bring forward further.
And you did a nice job. It struck me as he didn't seem to mind that here he was with the burdens of the world on him, but having his son around.
It was a relief.
It made him feel better.
I'll tell you one quick Tad story that's fun before we get to questions. So it's the night Lincoln gives his final speech. And it's a very legalistic address about his vision of Reconstruction. And I talk about it in the speech. And it's a very relatively federalist vision of Reconstruction. He doesn't want, he has a couple of, again, broad goals, indispensable conditions, but basically he wants, the communities to buy in, the states to buy in. And then he ends by saying, and I'd like to begin by opening the franchise. And Booth is in the audience, and he says, that means citizenship. And then,
Yeah, I actually did not know that. Because I knew he was he's actually in the picture of the inaugural. But he was also
at the final speech too. And he says to Lewis Powell, one of his co-conspirators, that's the last speech he's going to ever give. But at the reception afterwards, they're in the red room of the White House, and everyone's milling around. And somebody says, as they often did in those days, like, hang them all. And Tad interjects, because he's always running around at adult parties in the background. He's running around a lot in big meetings. Tad's always running around in the background. And Tad interjects and says, no, we must not hang them all. We must hang on to them. And Lincoln loves this and lifts him up into his arms and says, that's right, Tad, we must hang on to them. Yeah. I love that.
I do too. Okay, let's open it up for questions and let's see what we have from the audience. We have a question right there. Yeah, wait for the mic. And I may have a few more.
Thank you so much for coming. Given that 1864 wasn't necessarily the best year for the Union, given the bloodshed of the Overland Campaign and the rise of George McClellan, how did Lincoln manage to maneuver a political victory in 1864 with all those odds against him?
That's a great question.
Great question. So the question's about 1864 election. First of all, what an enormous risk. He's being advised by some of his aides. You don't need to go ahead with an election. We're having a civil war right now. And he says, no, we've got to go ahead with the election.
I believe you worked for a guy who was thought for a moment about postponing a Mayoral election in the wake of a
Now, that's been largely misinterpreted. He said he wanted 3 more months to secure ground zero.
Okay, sorry.
We can go down.
Go ahead.
We can go down that route later. But he refused, and because he said, look, if we allow our system of government to be delayed, then the enemies of democracy can already have said to have won. And most people thought he was going to lose. I mean, the smart money all thought he was going to lose. The Republican chairman, Lincoln himself famously writes a letter to the cabinet and he has them sign all the back of an envelope. They don't know what's inside. And inside is a Lincoln's prediction of defeat. And what happened, this is in August of 1864. What happens actually that day is Admiral Farragut takes Mobile, Alabama, and a few days later, Sherman takes Atlanta. And that totally changed the feeling in the streets, right? Because once you have also, these critical sort of arteries in the South, the tide of the war has turned. And the South has been basically praying that McClellan would win because, look, Lincoln believed that peace at any price was too expensive. But a lot of folks in the North, the peace Democrats and other folks, said, no, let's have peace, and if that means the perpetuation of slavery, that's just fine. But it really is the military victories that change the mood on the ground. And then it's an enormous vindication. He wins a higher percentage of the vote than he won the last time. And he wins the military vote, despite the fact he's running against a former general of the Army. So it's a huge vindication. He gives, and maybe I'll close this way at the very, very end, he gives, the speech after he wins re-election is one of the greatest and least appreciated Lincoln speeches, I think.
So just one question on that. Did the selection of Andrew Johnson help his re-election?
Yes, sorry, that's an important point. So
It was also his biggest mistake.
it is. It's his biggest mistake, but it's very inspired. Lincoln actually, and I should have said this, the Republican Party rebrands as the National Union Party, which speaks to the fact that Lincoln is very aware he's got to win votes from disaffected Democrats, and the Republican Party banner could be too divisive. So he runs as a National Union ticket, and he ditches Hannibal Hamlin, because when Lincoln's running in a four-person race in 1860s, before Republicans are really a third party in effect at the time, he needs an east-west balance, right? So he gets Maine and Illinois, and that balances him. But now he needs a north-south balance. So he gets the one senator who didn't, leave with his state to the Confederacy, Andrew Johnson, a guy he knew in their one term in Congress, who'd been a Tennessee military governor, and who the radicals thought was great. They thought he was going to be really tough. And so that was a very inspired choice, as was running on a National Union ticket. But as I get into, the worst mistake he ever made, there hadn't been a president assassinated up to that point, obviously. There hadn't been a president reelected since Andrew Jackson. But the radicals fundamentally misjudged their man, too. He wasn't a race warrior, he was a class warrior. He was driven by resentment.
Yes, sir.
Adam White, AEI. I really love the book. I'm glad you wrote it, and I'm glad you're here today.
Thank you.
I'd love to hear anything else you might add on that last public address, the Louisiana Reconstruction Address, which is such a gem, and like the Richmond visit, so overlooked. But then I also want to ask a question about the Confederate statute issue. Not so much what ought to be done today, but I'm wondering, as you thought about the end of Lincoln's life, the Reconstruction and what followed, do you have any thoughts on how the North, Americans in the North, maybe how they should have responded when those statues started going up a generation after the Civil War, right? I now obviously it's much more complicated, but I wonder what might the best reaction to that have been in its own time?
Interesting. Well, let me begin with the first part of your question first, which is Lincoln's last speech. There has been one very good book written solely about that speech, called Lincoln's Last Speech. But it's an unexpected address. It is not lyrical in the least.
Yeah.
It has a couple of lines that have endured, but it really is a very legalistic address. And as you correctly point out, it's largely about Louisiana's Reconstruction, which most people don't see coming. And there's a very odd backstory around that based upon the fact that most folks believe, I think correctly, that the bulk of the speech was written in February. And then it was basically, he wrote a new top to it. But it's because Louisiana had been under Union control, New Orleans had at least, and the surrounding parishes been under Union control since 1862. And they had some experience with multiracial democracy within regard to the Creole population, or at least that was Lincoln's thought at the time. And so he thought it would be a good laboratory for democracy, for Reconstruction, as it were. But what really strikes me about that speech is is that Lincoln, who of course is derided as a tyrant and and a big sort of top-down central government guy, actually has a very Federalist vision of Reconstruction. He wants localities to buy into Reconstruction. It's going to be a little bit different in every state. And he says, look, we want a lot of experimentation, and as long as they meet a couple of key thresholds, then it should be a fit for them, because he knows it's got to be organic. He says in one very prescient letter that around the time to I think the governor of Louisiana at the time, he says his vision is to allow blacks and whites to gradually outlive their old relations with each other. So he knows it's going to take time, but what he does want to do is ensure that there's a structure of justice and fairness. And here's where I think there would have been major departures with him and Andrew Johnson. I know he wouldn't have allowed the Freedmen's Bureau to lapse. I don't think he would have allowed the black codes to be imposed. I think there's great debate about, whether or not he would have granted land to free blacks. I think Lincoln the lawyer would have been at war with different aspects of his personality in that. But it's a very interesting speech. It's a legalistic speech, but it's one of the things you can draw on to really see that he has a developing vision of Reconstruction. It's not a completely blank slate. He's also very careful to say that he wants to experiment, and he's not going to be ideologically fixed. Right? He's flexible, not fanatical. But he keeps his eyes on a couple of great big goals. And then how you get to the goals, he does not disturb himself with, because that's going to be determined by facts on the ground. With regard to the Confederate statues, I'll say this. It's impossible due to the what if of what the North response should have been to the building at the time. It's understandable that when they were built, it was unfortunately in the service of a lost cause mythology, but also the children and grandchildren of these soldiers to try to redeem some sense of honor. University of Virginia did a very telling study which overlaid locations of Confederate statues with locations of lynchings, which I think is worth looking at. The other thing that always strikes me is one of the more contemporary Confederate statues, one of the last major statues to be erected, was to Nathan Bedford Forrest, Confederate general, one of the earliest Grand Wizards of the Ku Klux Klan, which was put in the Tennessee State Capitol in 1973. That's got nothing to do with anything related to the Civil War. That has everything to do with civil rights. So while I'm generally of the school that we should be building more statues, not taking one down, and certainly, by God, there needs to be a distinction between Confederate statues and Lincoln statues. And the Confederate statues should be in museums. But I think that it is appropriate to view them as people who took up arms against our country. And whatever short-term utility those communities or states took, I think, by and large, outlived its usefulness. I think the best speech and the most thoughtful speech about this is Mitch Landau's speech that he gave, which is also he published in book form, around his decision to take down the Lee statue in New Orleans, which he said, look, as a white Southerner, he didn't understand why it was such a big deal. Then he started educating himself about it and learned, among other things, that Robert E. Lee had never even been to New Orleans. And then so you question what's the real motivation when the statue was built. And it's a very thoughtful, searching exploration of the history and context and our own responsibilities.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Chad Adler. I'm a new staff member here at AEI. Thank you for being here today and for sharing your
Thank you.
This ideological and historic journey you've been on. So one of the immediate things that comes to mind for me is you use the expression "winning the peace" quite a few times throughout your discourse with President Doar. So in today's day and age, to bring the kind of Confederate statue issue around, America looks really divided right now. And it's been an issue that as a young person, I've seen basically all throughout my adult life. When, in your research, what is the number one lesson that you would say that our policymakers today can do to win the peace in American society back and kind of bring us all back to the center in a way that Lincoln would?
Another good question.
It's a good and important question. First of all, I'm passionate, as you can tell, about applied history, because I think applied history, looking for useful lessons, can offer some perspective on our own times. And the second founding, Lincoln's era, I think offers us a particularly strong foundation to have a conversation about who we are as a country. I'm going to speak at Mount Vernon later tonight. I'm doing a naturalization ceremony there later in the week too, which I'm incredibly honored by. Because my last book was about Washington's farewell address, tonight I'm going to give a talk about Washington and Lincoln and the way that Washington inspired Lincoln. They're very different men with different times. There's continuities of leadership. They are both uniters in a divided time, so to speak. But it's predicated upon this belief about America that I have, that is reflected in my family's experience, but I think most families' experience, which is that we are the only nation in the history of the world founded on an idea rather than a tribal identity. That makes it more incumbent upon us to tell stories that can unify our nation, which means it's incumbent upon us to make the old stories new again. There's a lot of ways to do that, right? The antithesis of that, and this is where we get off track as a nation, historically, whether in the Civil War era, late 1960s and early 70s, which is a more divided time than we commonly remember today, and today, is when political leaders start playing tribal politics. Tribal politics is the antithesis of who we are as a nation in a fundamental way, right? The national motto, E pluribus unum, for a reason. And I think Lincoln in particular, and here's where the Civil War, study of the Civil War and applied history lens can help us. It's a reminder we've been through far worse before. We'll get through this. We should steel ourselves with a sense of confidence around that. If Lincoln could remain committed to the idea that there is more that unites us than divides us as Americans in the middle of a civil war, surely we can aspire to that too. Empathy has been strained, but empathy is a key component of Lincoln's leadership. So's honesty, so's humor, so's humility. For me, politically, what the key to Lincoln's greatness is that he balances moral courage with moderation. He doesn't allow moral courage to slide into a sense of moral superiority. Right? He also reminds us interpersonally that kindness can be consistent with effective leadership. That's important too. His contemporaries, including General Sherman, recognized that his greatness stems from his goodness. And that's important. It's not that he was able to win everybody over. He was obviously widely hated by many people in his time. So surprisingly was Washington. But I think it's a matter of learning from those examples and trying to carry them forward in our own lives. When we're in positions of leadership, but not only that. And to be very not only skeptical, but I think when people try to divide to conquer in our politics and to play tribal politics, to recognize the very real danger that represents to our democratic republic experiment.
I noted when you gave you mentioned those qualities, you didn't say forgiveness. Would you say that forgiveness is also a quality of Lincoln?
Yes.
And that is necessary to reconciliation?
Yes, but I think, if you just build out his quality of empathy, just to put some meat on those bones. I mean, Lincoln practices the politics of the golden rule in a very fundamental way, and maybe that's actually a more even direct way to answer your question. The politics of the golden rule, it should be the basic social contract, right? Would you treat other people as you'd like to be treated? That doesn't seem to be factored into our political debates today, campaigning or governing. In fact, quite the opposite. And so it's a certain amount of empathy and compassion in action, right? I mean, it's little things he does. He says, I am not anti-South or anti-Southern, I'm anti-slavery. And then he says, they are just what we would be in their position. In private and in public, in the middle of the war, he calls Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee, and I love this, Jeffy D. and Bobby Lee. It's not that there weren't red meat rhetoric in politics then. It's a little dismissive, but it's also familial. It's familiar. It's a reminder that this is a family fight. And that example he carries forward again and again. So yes, forgiveness. And I do think, we were talking about this earlier, it is also reasonable to say that truth needs to precede reconciliation. So forgiveness is important. But Lincoln understood that decency can be the most effective form of politics, but people are more likely to listen to reason when greeted from a position of strength. So unconditional surrender, followed by a magnanimous peace. But that's in wartime, not in domestic politics.
Okay, we have time for one more question. We've got one. Yes, sir, right here in the front row. Wait for the mic, please. Thank you.
In contrast to Lincoln's magnanimity, didn't he impose military rule on New York and suspend liberties?
You're talking about the suspension of habeas corpus?
During the war. Yeah,
Sure,
suspension of
happy to
habeas
talk
corpus.
about that. So, you know, there is a dwindling but once robust cottage industry of people who really don't like Abraham Lincoln. And I covered them to some extent in my book, Wingnuts. And it goes about an argument that he's really a secret tyrant who created the war unnecessarily. And one of the chief arguments against him is his suspension of writ of habeas corpus. Now, I'm not going to say that suspending writ of habeas corpus is the high point of Lincoln's presidency, but if you look in the Constitution itself, the context in which it says that habeas corpus can be suspended is rebellion or insurrection, i.e. precisely what the country was facing at the time, which I think is important context around that. Even in New York. And look, I think the immediate context around that is not, it was not a long-lived writ. And you had the draft riots and a lot of things going on, and New York, you know, was a bastion of Copperhead sentiment for reasons of trade and financial interests primarily at that time. William Seward, being former New York senator and governor, you know, was from upstate Auburn, New York. So you have very different traditions, upstate, downstate at that time in that state. And indeed, you know, one of the things I'm fascinated by is how the Republican Party grew as a big tent anti-slavery party, containing everything from abolitionists to people who wanted to stop the spread of slavery. But it's really a moderate progressive party, a reform party of its time. And it began by winning state legislatures, not running someone for president. I'm getting into my next book right now, so I'm going to pull myself back. But I do think that it's I think judged fairly with any sense of perspective, that Lincoln did as well as any human being could in that particular circumstance. And perfect's never on the menu, and he'd be the first to admit it. That's one of the self-effacing things about him. I'll close by this, if I may.
Sure.
I mentioned the line from Lincoln's speech, the night he wins re-election. And it's not a well-known speech, but I think it's my favorite line from Lincoln, closely with that last paragraph of the Second Inaugural. Because I think it sums up applied history, but it also sums up that sense of humility and perspective and proportion that we can get. Lincoln said the night he wins re-election, "Human nature will not change. In any future great national trial, compared with the men of this, we shall have as weak and as strong, as silly and as wise, as good and as bad. Let us therefore study the incidents of this as philosophy to learn wisdom from, and none of them as wrongs to be revenged." That's the epigraph of the book for a reason, because to me it's all there. First of all, let's take our heroes off the pedestal. Let's understand them as flawed, because it makes them more interesting. Let's make it less intimidating to aspire to what they gave us. To understand that it's a continuum of human beings doing the best they can. And then the mere fact that Lincoln has the imagination to think about himself in that moment, seen through the eyes of the future, looking back at the past, and saying that study history as philosophy to learn wisdom from. Learn what works. And don't fixate on the past from a spirit of resentment and revenge, because that's the opposite of reconciliation. And that's the message that Lincoln's leadership carries forward.
And with that, we'll close our discussion for tonight. Thank you very much, John. That's great.